guy in his 20s reads Infinite Jest. How I remembered you're allowed to have a book as a little treat. If for no other reason than hailing from Bloomington Normal and being a fellow Redbird, I've recently taken a pretty big interest in the work of David Foster Wallace. Footnote 1. I think it would be almost disrespectful if I didn't add footnotes, so here you go. It also took everything I had not to wear a bandana everywhere for the last 100 or so pages of the book. I initially thought it was a shame I missed him as a professor by about 20 years, but then I learned how much of a hard-ass English teacher he was, and realized I probably didn't have the chops for his class anyway. Footnote 2. I did my undergrad and grad degrees at ISU from 2018 to 2023. According to him, in each course he taught, he would abandon the scheduled literature content for an emergency 3-week grammar section, usually after the students submitted their first paper. I'm sure I'll make him turn in his grave with my near broken English, but I'm also sure he'll get over it eventually. I think I'm really drawn to Wallace because his work kind of straddles creative nonfiction and essayistic fiction. Most of the books I've read in my life have been nonfiction, and I've only ever written nonfiction, so his writing, especially its meta-references to academic writing, has been a real breath of fresh air for me. This of course means I haven't read much literary fiction, something I'm trying to do more now that I have more free time. Footnote 3. And now that I'm not in college anymore, I've realized you are actually allowed to read fiction and enjoy doing it. So naturally, I decided to start this journey with a light reading of Infinite Jest. It turned out to be such a challenge that I had to take a break in the middle to read an easier book called Blood Meridian, and another to read Slaughterhouse-Five, and then another to read Carrie, which I loved, really liked, and liked in the order I listed them. 3 months later, including the breaks, I have finally finished this thing. I am happy to report that, while it did take over my life for the last few hundred pages, my sanity is largely intact, and I can deliver a sober analysis for you here. I'll start by saying that you really do have to read this more than once to understand it, or at least I do. I think I understand all the major themes happening here, and I do have novel things to say about it, but this is just such a massive book that there's no way you can unpack it all in one reading, which is really one of its major strengths. With this in mind, I'll give you my understanding of the world, writing style, characters, and plot. For one, you may need it if you haven't read this, and for two, it may help clarify where I'm coming from if you have read it, and something I'm saying doesn't make any sense. One last note here, I wouldn't worry about spoilers. The events of the plot are really not the main point. I can spoil this book by discussing the plot about as much as I could spoil a national park by showing you a picture of it. In what world is this taking place? Infinite Jest takes place in the near future with unnumbered years. At some point, famous crooner Johnny Gentle gets elected president on a campaign of being vaguely different and more productive than your typical president. As a way of reversing the rampant trash buildup in the Boston area, he builds catapults to launch the trash from Boston into somewhere else in New England called the Great Concavity. Characters in Boston can constantly hear these catapults in the background. He then tries to force Canada to take the Great Concavity into its own territory, so he can say he technically removed trash from the country. In the end, Canada and Mexico are forcibly consolidated with the United States into the Organization of North American Nations, or ONAN, onan being an old term for masturbation. Since the American president is also in charge of ONAN, he can make Canada take control of the Great Concavity, and Johnny Gentle has now successfully cleaned his country. This has unfortunately resulted in the formation of dozens of rebel political factions in Quebec, most notably Les Assassins des Fronteaux. Footnote 4. Misspelled French for the wheelchair assassins. The former residents of what is now the Great Concavity are forcibly relocated and prohibited from having crying babies or anything that makes them look like refugees, because that makes the country look bad. Since the United States has now lost a great part of its territory and had to pay to fight the battle with Canada so they would take it, it becomes necessary to create a new way of raising funds. The United States decides to sell the naming rights of calendar years to corporations, so the years are no longer numbered and are now called the Year of the Whopper, the Year of the Glad Trash Bag, and the Year of the Depend Adult Undergarment, which is when most of the story takes place. This is one of my favorite elements of Infinite Jest because the book is always in the future, even if you read it 30 years after its publication like I did. Writing style and structure. The tone is incredibly deadpan. When ridiculous aspects of the world, like the catapults and the Great Concavity, or silly events in the narrative, like someone committing suicide by, quote, sticking his head in the microwave, are depicted, they are done so with the same tone as a piece of nonfiction, complete with extensive footnotes. We basically alternate between this and episodes the characters have where they're breaking down or doing something crazy that are written as long, uninterrupted streams of consciousness. The broad structure of the book is dialectic. It doesn't have much of a linear narrative, and it's deeply autobiographical. There are basically two main stories serving as the book's two poles. One is at a prestigious tennis academy, which seems to represent a young David Foster Wallace. The other is at a halfway house, which seems to represent Wallace how he was around the time he wrote the book. The two poles also seem to represent the two different ways you can live your life in the world of infinite jest. You are either addicted to success and performance, the pressure of which ultimately crushes you, or you're addicted to actual drugs, which presents an ultimately unbearable lack of meaning and structure in your life, not to mention the physical toll they take on your body. Wallace also seems to be diagnosing America in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, as a country at the end of history, inebriated and delirious over its great victory, with all the power and knowledge in the world, but without the soul or purpose to do anything with it except chase one of infinite jest's two ultimately fruitless paths. Putting the footnotes at the end of the book was also a deliberate choice by Wallace, as the reader has to literally flip back and forth while reading, the same way a tennis ball goes back and forth in the dialogue between two players, and the same way the two major stories here are in a back and forth dialogue with each other. Characters. So there are a ton of characters, and there's no way I'll remember them all. I was initially going to try and list as many as I could and describe them to you, but I decided that's silly, so I'll let you know who Gately and Hal are, and then I'll try filling in some of the background characters. Hal Incandenza is a 17-year-old student at Enfield Tennis Academy. He is ranked second nationally for his age group and is a prodigious academic. In the opening chapter of the book, the deans at the University of Arizona acknowledge his incredible writing, and he rattles off a number of statements about philosophy and other academic subjects that any teenage Redditor could mindlessly regurgitate now, but would have been a real achievement in the 90s. Footnote 5. Wallace got his MFA from the University of Arizona. Throughout the book, he wrestles with his messed up family, including his deceased father, who was himself a genius until he put his head in the microwave. Other Incandenzas include Orrin, the oldest brother, a sex addict and NFL punter who accidentally killed the family dog in the wildest and most gruesome way imaginable. We also have Avril, the mother who so regularly commits maternal suicide that she convinces herself not to blame Orrin, even though he initially lies about it, because she doesn't want him to feel bad. And Mario, the middle child, who has several disabilities and serves as a Christ figure for the story. Hal spends most of the book struggling with depression, drug addiction, and some normal teenage things. Don Gately is a reformed burglar, drug addict, and Boston street tough who is now a staff member at the Ennett House Drug and Alcohol Recovery House, where Hal is incredibly intelligent and has memorized at least one version of the Oxford Dictionary. Gately is almost illiterate and serves as Hal's antithesis. His head is described as perfectly square, and his nickname, Bim, means big, indestructible moron. Where Hal knows everything but makes dumb decisions and struggles with not really having a soul, Gately doesn't know anything, but he's the heart and soul of the book. There's also Joelle Van Dyne, a woman so beautiful she joins the union of hideously and improbably deformed, and wears a veil over her face. She was also the lead actress in the movie Infinite Jest, directed by Hal's father, James O. Incandenza, and believed to be so entertaining anyone who watches it just rewatches it forever and eventually dies. Remy Marat, a member of the Wheelchair Assassins, and Hugh Steepley, an own and Office of Unspecified Services agent, both of them triple or quadruple agents, spend several chapters on the side of a mountain they hiked and apparently wheeled up to discuss finding the Infinite Jest movie. Their dialogue is microcosmic of the entire book. There are dozens of other characters, including the other students and staff at the Tennis Academy, residents and staff at Ennett House, members of the President's Cabinet and Intelligence Community, Quebecois terrorists, etc. What actually happens in the plot? Not too many things really happen in the plot, and most of the character arcs don't get resolved. Hal's is really the only one that gets a full resolution, and Don kind of gets one too. That's really it. The story spends the vast majority of its time introducing us to the characters. Now, there are definitely some crazy events that happen. There's a scene where the wheelchair assassins break into a video store because they're looking for the Infinite Jest movie. Some of them have suction cups on their hands, and they shoot out of their chairs, grab onto the wall, and grapple around as they tear up the store. What they end up doing to the lone present employee is astonishing, and I'll just leave it there because that actually would be a spoiler. The two major plot points are probably Hal losing an important match to a junior player, which triggers a depressive arc for him, and Gately getting into a brawl with a group including Randy Lentz, an Ennet House resident who mitigates his crack addiction by torturing and killing small animals. This leaves Gately in the hospital and triggers a section of the book where Hal struggles with not feeling anything and Gately struggles with feeling unbearable pain. What kind of book is Infinite Jest? I should also say something about the lowercase d dystopia of Infinite Jest. Wallace seems to be less interested in making predictions or warning the reader about the future, and more interested in laughing and crying with the reader about the present. In this regard, he's much more similar to Paul Verhoeven than he is to someone like Orwell, Asimov, or Harlan Ellison. People often point to the similarities between Johnny Gentle and Donald Trump, and they are certainly uncanny, but I could just as easily see him as a parody of Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan, which I now think is a pretty accurate way of describing Trump. Footnote 6. Especially with the recent Trump-Clinton news. The real brilliance in Wallace's world building is that, for one, he understands that many scary things are scary precisely because they're funny, and vice versa. And for two, he understands exactly what is so funny and so scary about American society. In fact, many of the setting's literal elements are deliberately written to be nonsensical, like the catapults, the wheelchair assassins, and the Infinite Jest movie. But certain societal things he identifies, like rampant addiction and automation, widening class disparities, total panic and ineptitude when it's time to vote for anything, and the utterly hollow spirit of the information age, were present in the 90s, are still present now, and only seem to be getting worse. Footnote 7. At least I think they were. I wasn't actually alive when this book was published. Again, and I can't hammer this home enough, it's all really scary precisely because it's so funny. The president isn't supposed to be a clown. Systems that make the entire world run aren't supposed to be comically dysfunctional. Campaign finance isn't supposed to be comically corrupt. Footnote 8. And this book was written a decade and a half before the Super PAC. It's also scary because it's all such a big joke. So who cares? So far, I've basically covered Infinite Jest as a work of deeply ironic postmodern literature, but it would be an incredible disservice to the novel and to the author if I left my review here because that's not really what this book is. The way I understand it, we're in dialogue with what Wallace seems to think is an almost oppressive and played out irony and cynicism in postmodern literature. Think of novels, and movies and shows, that assume life doesn't have an inherent meaning, that everything is one big joke. That's not what we're doing here. I think we are essentially siding with the residents of the halfway house over the students at the tennis academy. Infinite Jest is therefore an autobiographical novel where Wallace explains, or really info dumps about, how he learned to deal with his own issues and navigate the horrors of the contemporary world as best he could. His answer is basically that you have to give yourself completely to something. You need some kind of cause or passion or person you love unconditionally. Here are some passages I think best exemplify this. From page 53. American experience seems to suggest that people are virtually unlimited in their need to give themselves away on various levels. Some just prefer to do it in secret. From page 107. Our attachments are our temple, what we worship, no? What we give ourselves to, what we invest with faith. Attachments are of great seriousness. Choose your attachments carefully. Choose your temple of fanaticism with great care. From pages 117 to 118. It's no accident they say you eat, sleep, breathe tennis here. These are autonomical. Accretive means accumulating, through sheer, mindless, repeated motions. The machine language of the muscles, until you can do it without thinking about it. Play. From page 357. You have to want to take the suggestions, want to abide by the traditions of anonymity, humility, surrender to the group conscience. If you don't obey, nobody will kick you out. They won't have to. You'll end up kicking yourself out if you steer by your own sick will. From page 900. We are all dying to give our lives away to something, maybe. God or Satan, politics or grammar, topology or philately. The objects seemed incidental to this will to give ourselves away, utterly. To games or needles, to some other person, something pathetic about it, a flight from in the form of a plunging into. Essentially, I think he means that we, collectively and individually, still have souls. I find this to be a profoundly uplifting, optimistic view, and the antithesis of postmodern literature. Whether you really have to give yourself to a thing, a collection of things, it does seem like people still want to, or at least have an involuntary tendency to do so. That this is evidenced by our myriad addictions, overwhelming pressure to succeed as an individual, and furious outrage, whether misguided or not, over world events, whether we consume them in the form of toxic internet sludge or not, is a really beautiful sentiment to me. It makes me think that the great machine, late neoliberalism, the end of history, exerts control over, but has not and maybe cannot annihilate the human spirit. Is it good? I mean, the short answer is yes. It's certainly worth your time if you find this review worth your time. I'm only aware of two prominent negative reviews. One is Harold Bloom's, which he gave in an interview for Women's Wear Daily. He famously just straight up said, quote, "He can't think, he can't write, there's just no discernible talent," end quote. While all of those statements are obviously not true, I always thought it was interesting that Bloom didn't give any substantive criticism of the book. He just gets asked about it and then basically tells David Foster Wallace to go fuck himself. He even complains that Wallace used a line from Hamlet for the title of Infinite Jest because Bloom was a Shakespeare fanatic and hated Wallace. I thought all of this was confusing until I got to page 911 on Infinite Jest. Hal is watching one of his father's movies about professors giving lectures to disengaged students. It's described as, quote, Paul Anthony Heaven reading his lecture to a crowd of dead-eyed kids picking at themselves and drawing vacant airplane and genitalia doodles on their college rule notepads, reading stupefyingly turgid-sounding shit, end quote. And then it links to a footnote that says, quote, sounding rather suspiciously like Professor H. Bloom's turgid studies of artistic influenza, end quote. Now, there are a lot of things I like about Harold Bloom, but he is an accomplished literary critic and academic, and as such he's petty, vindictive, and gets his feelings hurt pretty easily. Footnote 9. I understand that I am, in fact, writing a piece of literary criticism, and therefore could be called a literary critic as well. But the difference between Bloom and I is that I am not accomplished at it, so I'm still a good hang. And in fairness to Bloom, Wallace was kind of a little smartass, but I wholeheartedly think this line in the novel is the beginning and end of Bloom's issue with it. The other notable review is on Goodreads by this guy named Warwick. He spends most of his review writing fan fiction where imaginary people get mad at him, and even put him on trial and eagerly try to sentence him to death for not liking Infinite Jest. The few sentences dedicated to substantive criticism mostly focus on his dislike of the writing style and his nitpicking over incorrect citations. Credit to Warwick, though, because he's clearly read the book and even quotes it several times in his review. He also manages to make a few valid, if banal, points, like identifying the chapter where Wallace unsuccessfully attempts to write in the voice of a black character. In my humble opinion, Infinite Jest is a great book, and a 5 out of 5. It's some of the most fun I've ever had consuming fiction of any medium, and it's made me really excited to check out the rest of his work, and the works of his influences and contemporaries. Therefore, I think you should read it, but understand that it's difficult. People can feel however they want about audiobooks, but there was no way I was going to just sit down and read a physical copy of this from front to back. If I was reading late at night and got tired, I would turn on the audiobook and read along with it. If I was driving, walking somewhere, making dinner, folding laundry, or whatever, I was listening to the audiobook. Plus, playing it at 1.2 speed, because it's 65 hours long at normal speed, was honestly pretty appropriate because the writing style is basically just a guy frantically info-dumping at you about a fictional universe he's created. So it's kind of like reading 1,100 pages worth of your most insane relative's Facebook posts, if that's the sort of thing you're into.